Hello and good evening to In Narratives. We are conducting a session after quite a few months, but I'm so thankful to Dr. Rituparna Patgiri for taking some time out and doing this today. She's going to speak on a very important topic. She's going to talk on food politics in university hostels in India. Before she starts, I'll formally introduce her. She teaches sociology at Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi, and has previously taught in Jamia Millia Islamia University and Gauhati University. She has a PhD in sociology from JNU. Dr. Patgiri was a recipient of the Zuban Sasakawa Peace Foundation grants for young researchers from the Northeast for 2020-2021. Some of her recent publications include The Role of Food in Constructing Womanhood, a study of menstruation in Guwahati, changing food habits of urban middle class youth in India, ordering in, we're all guilty of that, um, community building and exclusion, the role of food in university hostels in New Delhi. This was published in 2022. She is passionate about making academic knowledge accessible to the public. She is one of the co-founders of Doing Sociology. It's an academic blog dedicated to promoting sociological consciousness amongst young students and scholars. She is currently serving as the associate editor of the South Asian Region in Society. It's a journal published by Springer Nature that explores the latest scholarship on the central questions of contemporary society. Thank you so much, Dr. Padgiri. I guess you could start. The floor is yours.
Uh, First of all, let me thank you, Sanchali, for giving me this opportunity, and to N Narratives as well for giving me this platform to speak. It's a wonderful, and of course, initiative, and I have enjoyed watching some of the videos in the recent past. Let me
Thank you.
actually talk by just giving an introduction to why it is necessary to talk about food politics in university hostels in India at this moment. I think the inspiration to talk about it came to me after I saw this news item that IIT Bombay was facing uproar and controversy after there was an attempt to mark a particular space only for vegetarians. And then when Sanchali reached out to me with a proposal to speak about something, I suggested that let's talk about hostel food politics. Most of this talk is going to be based on my paper, Community Building and Exclusion, the role of food in university hostels in New Delhi, which has already been published in Society in 2022. But I would also like to connect the paper to the larger context and the recent happenings in terms of food politics in campuses or universities. To give a very brief introduction, the relationship between food and educational institutions is nothing new. The two are integrally connected, and there is this idea or association that the school meal, for instance, in the UK, is seen as a symbolic occasion that builds unity and cohesion among students. There's also been a study of the German Mensa or canteens in universities and how they impact one's food choices and patterns. Similarly, when one looks at midday meals in India, one of the attempts was not only to fight malnutrition and poverty amongst school going children, but also build ideas of cohesion and unity. It's primarily because there is this association of sociability with food. Food is seen as an agent of social cohesion. Eating together, it brings people together as well. Now, when one thinks about hostel food, there have been previous studies as well that have looked at the relationship between food and education in the Indian context as well. But the context that I would like to explore is that of central universities, or universities in the capital of the country, which are seen as very cosmopolitan educational institutions. What it means is that people from diverse social backgrounds, who have diverse kinds of social identities, cultural milieux, come together to live in one space. And food, in a lot of food studies and food sociology, is also seen as something of a catalyst or an agent that migrants carry with themselves wherever they go to. Now, it is not surprising that in these universities, which are seen as spaces that are cosmopolitan, people from different parts of the country come to, study. Particularly in this paper, the two universities that I had looked at were JNU and Delhi University, two of the most cosmopolitan universities in the country, and also, of course, places where, even today, there is the possibility of availing affordable education. Now, in that context, migration is a key factor. And I cannot stress it enough when I say that migrants, when they come to any new place, look for affordability and security. And hostel spaces are seen as spaces that would provide them with that, because these are seen as government, public universities, with those spaces where you would be able to find a piece of your home. And the question of marginal identities is also very important. The very fact that these are public universities means that people from marginalized identities are admitted into these places, particularly because of the prevalence of what we know of as affirmative action. Now, what it means is that these campuses and hostels become cheaper, affordable places for them to inhabit and also, of course, eat their meals. One identity that I would like to really highlight in this context is gender. When one thinks about gender, it is actually very, very interesting to see the importance of hostels, because for many parents, they wouldn't want to send their daughters to these big cities from smaller cities if they don't get university or college accommodation. So the idea is that if you're staying outside, your security can be at risk. Therefore, the importance of these hostel spaces cannot be stressed enough. Similarly, for other marginalized identities like, let's say, religion or even region, in many cases, as I will talk about throughout this presentation, it becomes important that they have these government public spaces where discrimination on the basis of identity in terms of allocation of space can be minimalized. So, there is an importance of these spaces. Going back to that point about food being a catalyst in building social relationships. So, once you are a hosteler, you're a student of the campus, the meals that you share with one another actually becomes a way in which you forge friendships, you build relationships, because you meet people in the university and hostel messes. So therefore, what you're eating, how you're eating, with whom you're eating matters a lot. Right now, there is this stress on how that consumption of food is happening. So, at one side, you have these university hostels as public spaces for students where migrants come seeking, affordability, security, and at the same time, there is also the attempt to build social relationships, and this happens in spaces like the messes. A little bit about my setting and methods employed, because I also want to stress that this is an empirical study, and it is based on data collection that I did in two premier universities in New Delhi, JNU and Delhi University. Now, when I talk about my method, this is where I think, there is an interesting insider outsider dynamic, because for me, I was an insider, and yet sometimes I did feel like an outsider. What do I mean by that? Well, as an insider, it means that I was a hosteler and I lived in the hostel in both universities during my tenure in DU as well, BA and MA, and in JNU during my MPhil and PhD. But I also felt like an outsider sometimes, because the inspiration to work on hostel food actually came to me because I felt so alienated from the kind of food that people were eating in these two spaces. Therefore, that dynamic that I had was something that I explored using these methods of autoethnography, ethnography, observation, and in-depth interviews. Now, for me, I think the binary between the home and the field was also questioned and very tricky, because primarily as a field worker, you are trained to go to a field which is not your home. So you're supposed to go away and do your field work. But in this scenario, my field was actually the space that I was inhabiting. It was also my home. Therefore, the binary that we generally see between the home and the field did not exist. And I was kind of navigating that domain of being an insider as well as an outsider sometimes within that, division or non division between the home and the field. Autoethnography is interesting because this paper came out in 2022, and in the COVID times, it became a method of prime importance. I'm not saying that it originated during that time, just that it became more popular considering the nature of the pandemic that we were dealing with. And for me as well, it was a time in which I could reflect on my own relationships as a migrant and as a food sociologist and scholar with what the meaning of food that I was eating in these hostel spaces meant. Right? Just a quick, recap, in the sense that this was primarily a qualitative study that I conducted on food in university hostels. Now, I want to talk about how hostel food helps in building these ideas of community and, what is the meat of the matter. As I had already said, that when one thinks about food in these collective communal spaces, immediately we have to think about its social purpose, the meaning that, or the role that food plays. Now, in the mess itself, because a very common kind of meal is served to every person, irrespective of their identity, it is seen as an attempt at building community or a feeling of collectivity. For instance, in many Delhi University hostels, there is this regulation that you have to eat your meal in the mess itself, and you cannot carry the food back to your room. Now, this may seem a little strict, but the reasoning that the authorities provide is that, you're supposed to eat in the mess, meet new people, talk to them, and develop this feeling of eating together. It is also the space where you build friendships around food, where you may have, some homemade pickle with you, and you share it with the people across the table who are sitting and having, a meal with you. You may not know them. And at the same time, the special occasions that are celebrated, for instance, be it festivals or a special dinner or sick food, which is not a special occasion per se, but a special, or an exceptional, situation, it again stresses this fact that hostel is also a space where you get food like home, and you're building a community by partaking in these, measures and in these activities together. In fact, during my stay and what I would call my fieldwork, I came across several identities and examples of how people talked very highly about how eating together made them aware of diverse food practices, of how things were eaten. For instance, for many, people from the northeastern region or Assam in particular, eating curd, what we know of as dahi, is something that is done after the meal. Whereas in many parts of northern India, you mixed, the curd with rice and dal, or, you eat it together. So that is again something that you learn because you're looking at these diverse practices shaping up in front of you. So there is a beautiful part of how interaction and integrity and, unity exist. However, the point is that this is one side of the story, where the focus probably is on how the community building part takes place through the food that is provided in these hostels. But there are several other factors that can create a very significant sense of exclusion that people may face. A lot of respondents in my study, particularly, no surprises for guessing, when it came to from marginalized identities, argued that they did not feel a sense of the community that, the authorities or many others, spoke about. They felt excluded, and this exclusion was at multiple levels. One of the one of the levels of exclusion sorry, can be captured through this idea of what constitutes a pungent or a dirty smell versus what would be seen as a fragrance. While food is mostly seen as aromatic in nature, and the very idea of eating or cooking beautiful food, or good food, is supposed to make you excited and enchanted, a lot of food is in fact seen as pungent and smelly. Now, there are again no surprises when we think about ideas that are associated with these dirty smell. Anthropologist Dolly Kikon talks about how the food that tribal communities from many northeastern states eat is seen as dirty food because, in the eyes of many people, or rather in terms of the smelling ability, or the smelling need, it feels to be pungent. Now, this is not limited to the Indian context itself, because if one goes back to the early days of the pandemic, a lot of stereotyping and prejudice was associated with bat meat, and subsequently with the community that was seen as responsible for eating bat meat and bringing the pandemic, the Chinese. So, again, there is this association of food with diseases, with smell, versus food that is seen as fragrance. So, a lot of my respondents from many regions of the Northeast argued that the food that is served in these university hostels, which are supposedly cosmopolitan spaces, were actually exclusive of the kind of food that they considered to be their own. So, their food was completely out of the menu, and there was no space for it. There was a hegemonic kind of imposition of food habits. The second level of exclusion, meat, and what is seen as acceptable forms of meat, is actually very connected to it. This is also at the heart of the current debate in IIT Bombay and several other spaces across the country. So, meat again has very different connotations in the Indian context. As we all know, that there has also been this controversy about Sudha Murthy, who came out very recently saying that she carries her own personal spoon wherever she goes because she fears that there will be mixing of non-vegetarian food with vegetarian food. Her being a vegetarian. Again, when one thinks about veganism or vegetarianism in the West, it is primarily seen as a lifestyle or as a matter of choice. But in the Indian context, it is rooted in ideas of purity and pollution, heavily influenced by ideas of caste and ethnicity. So, even when we think about meat as a food item, it becomes loaded with these meanings of impurity, because many upper caste across the country, particularly in the northern belts, do not consume meat and maybe certain forms of meat. Within meat as well, there are acceptable and non acceptable forms of meat. There are gradations. So, this gradation is very clearly reflected in the menu of hostel food that is served in particularly the hostels that I am talking about, because you could see that chicken and egg made it to the menu regularly, whereas meat forms like mutton, pork, beef, or even fish was rare. Fish should still be served in certain menus. Again, the idea being that there are certain forms of meat that people could consume, and therefore they were to be included in the menu, whereas others wouldn't be. Now, many of these respondents who are from Northeast India said that their staple meat is pork, but they do not have pork in the menu in these spaces. So, again, there is a layering of exclusion. So, this idea of the community is incomplete for them. So, what happens is that food becomes a reminder of difference. It acts as something that, clearly demarcates that this space is not heterogeneous but homogeneous. There are these ideas. At this point, it is pertinent to bring out these two images that I have crisscrossed across. I have placed crisscross. Sorry, I've placed across each other in my slide, in which there is this idea that is promoted that, why non-veg food is not served in the canteen or in the hostel is because 90% students are vegetarian. This is what the principal of a premier college in Delhi University said. There was this controversy that meat and non vegetarian food was removed from the college canteen and hostel. Whereas the image on the other side says that 7 out of 10 people relish non vegetarian items, East and South lead the way. Now, what this means is that there is a myth of a vegetarian India, or the fact that Indian population primarily is vegetarian. Now, that myth is created and sold primarily because a minuscule portion of the population may not be consuming one form of the meat or the other. But it is this minuscule population which is also powerful in making decisions. And therefore, this myth of vegetarianism serves that purpose of, keeping meat out of the menu. One cannot really talk about food without talking about food and the intersections with identity. Let me talk about, some identities, because it is not really possible to talk about all in a limited span of time. One thinks about gender and food. Now, there is a lot of work in this area in the past as well, and there is a lot of evolving contemporary work. There is this association between femininity and diet restriction. So a feminine body is seen as a thin curvy body which is, not consuming a lot of food. What it means is that if you are a female or a woman, you're supposed to be controlling the amount of food that you eat, and you're also supposed to keep in mind that, your intake should be less. Now, in the hostel spaces, also, this idea of femininity gets reflected. For instance, even in a progressive space like JNU, you would see that there were very subtle differences in the way different in the way food was regulated in women's hostels. In some hostels there was a restriction in the number of idlis that you could eat, but there were no such restrictions in the boys hostel. Similarly, even the caterers and the managers to whom I spoke to very informally during this work actually admitted that they were scared of the boys and therefore would put in more effort when it came to maintaining food quality in boys' hostels compared to girls' hostels. The reason being that they had heard stories of how boys would break into a fit of rage if the food wasn't good, and therefore it would be scary to confront young boys, with young blood. Whereas when it came to girls, it was easier to manage because girls are not like boys in their words and, much more controlled when it came to even complaining. So the idea of food itself is also in that sense rooted with how gender and femininity operate. The other identity that I want to talk about is, of course, food and class. And this has implications for caste as well. Because these are spaces, as I had mentioned in the beginning of the presentation itself, that are primarily, spaces where the marginalized have access to some form of education, it becomes very difficult for them to actually, survive if the fee or the rate of food goes up. Now, there have been sections of the hostelers who have been unhappy time and again and have complained about how the quality needs to be improved, irrespective of the fact that they may be asked to pay a little higher. But their contention is that we deserve to eat nutritious and good quality food. But for many people from a marginalized class background, the amount that they're already paying is a lot. Therefore, if in the name of food quality, the rate goes up, it becomes even more difficult for them to sort of adjust in such a situation. Again, when one thinks about these special occasions that I mentioned, which are seen as ways in which community building is encouraged, they can also become ways in which exclusion is practiced. For instance, food festivals, special dinners, hostel nights, they all cost more money than a normal ordinary meal would in a hostel. They of course, residents are also encouraged to invite their friends, bring them along. But if you have to do that, you also may have to pay for their meals. So if you're from a marginalized caste, class, or gender background, you face significant hurdles in terms of how you enjoy these moments, which are seen as very, very special occasions. So this idea of special, but special for whom, clearly exists in that sense. Because while we may think that a special dinner cost rupees 80 or rupees 100, at least at the time when I did my field work, may not be a lot of money for an upper class or a middle class person. For someone who is from a marginalized background, even that could be a lot of money. So then these spaces are, maybe non-intentionally or intentionally, become spaces where food becomes a way to remind them of their continued exclusion. So the identity part is very crucial. I've already spoken about ethnicity and race in terms of talking about the question from the Northeast, that how food from the region is completely excluded when it comes to the menu making. And at the same time, also about religion, because we are not even talking about food that can be served other than foods that are seen as edible by upper caste Hindus. So these ideas of exclusion operate simultaneously with ideas of community building, which are propagated by, one section or hostile authorities. Now, this is the controversy in question that actually prompted me to speak about this, because this is the poster or the notice that was stuck in one of the hostels in IIT Bombay. Vegetarian only are allowed to sit here. Now, while this may seem as an innocent kind of a marking of a public space, it is really not, and it is rooted in the practice of casteism and impurity that heavily marks Indian society. The response to it is very interesting, because there were student groups that protested against this sign coming up, and one of the response is what is on the screen, and I'm just reading it out. Enabling interdining practices has been a major force of the anti-caste movements to foster communal harmony. Self-seclusion and ostracization of others on dietary preferences is a way to maintain caste supremacy. So the response itself illustrates what I've been trying to say, that when one thinks about food choices, even in spaces like university hostels, it is not about individual choice. It's actually about, communities. It's actually about larger questions of politics and economics. So being a vegetarian is a personal choice. But when that becomes a way to mark spaces as only for vegetarians, it becomes a way to also exclude others. Now, this is not the first time that this debate or this controversy has erupted in the Indian context. I already gave the example of Sudha Murthy, and there have been several examples in the recent past itself when a lot of vegetarians have argued that they would like to be respected for their food choice, and that non-vegetarians should be eating separately. In fact, in many IITs and NLUs, this also is the practice, where you could find separate messes for vegetarians and non vegetarians. Now, if you are thinking that it is not a big deal because people have the choice to eat and sit wherever they want, again, let's go back to the premise of this presentation itself. If food is a way of bringing together social unity and social cohesion, or encouraging social interaction, how can you be talking about any of it if you're not even sitting together and eating together? So that is where we understand that the food that is served in these university hostels itself is also rooted in the larger geopolitics of what we see as this country or nation state, particularly with the question of migration, in which there is increasing migration to larger cities from smaller cities. This idea of who eats what, the question of heterogeneity, they become particularly important. Again, ideas of what are smelly food are not limited to the hostel menu itself, because it is not that people from the northeastern region do not face vulnerability and discrimination outside the hostel spaces. In fact, a lot of people face hostility from landlords who don't want to rent to non-vegetarians, be it people from the northeastern region or Muslims, primarily because of the kind of food that they eat. This relationship between food and migrant students tell us that hostel food is actually closely tied to the concept of belonging to a community, but whose community and for whom. The idea of food itself is not homogeneous, but it is fragmented and exclusionary. And these recent studies across the country also tell us that these fissures have existed for a long time, and it is only going to be difficult when we think about the future. Let me actually conclude by saying that we all know that these campuses are public spaces. They are one of the few remaining spaces where accessible education is possible for large sections of the country. While there is an attempt to promote an idea of a community that is homogeneous, that is actually not the reality, because in reality, different ideas of community and identity exist, and therefore it makes sense if hostels are able to recognize that point, if university spaces are actually able to recognize that and act on that. On that note, I'll end.
Thank you, Dr. Patgiri, for such an interesting and enlightening discussion. I just wanted to know, you were talking about, I mean, it just goes on to show that nothing can be studied in isolation. Everything, there are so many factors overlapping all the time. So I'm just curious, I mean, during your study, did you come across any such respondent who, I'm sure you have, I just want to know uh, what they had to say about it. Have you come across anyone who regulated their food habits in order to feel included in that space?
Yeah, so there were several girls in my hostel whom I spoke to, and they said that they did regulate their non-veg intake when it came to, for instance, eating meat, to feel included. Because what happens is, let's say there's one person who's a non-vegetarian in a primarily vegetarian group, then it becomes non-feasible both practically and financially for them to eat non-veg food, because they would be the only ones spending on the non-veg food. Therefore they would self-regulate themselves and order veg food, even to blend in, because that would be the easier way to go. There were also regulations which were interestingly from others. And this is very interesting when one notices food politics in the hostels, because there were these girls who would cook. Now, cooking in hostels is actually illegal, but students still do it. Uh, but there is this fear also that if others find out, there will be a fight. There were these two girls who would cook, and they would cook meat sometimes, and they would choose the evening time to finish cooking, generally around 4:30 to 6:30, because they would say that that is the time when the least amount of people in the hostel would, remain, because everyone would go out to have tea, or maybe take a walk or meet friends, and they found it convenient because the aroma of meat would not disturb others, and they wouldn't have to sort of fit in and keep an eye on who is walking past them or things like that. In terms of washing the meat also, they would be very, very clear about not dropping any piece or remnant in the wash basins, because they knew that that would invite specific kinds of complaints from other residents. So these were ways in which people would regulate their food habits.
Oh, uh, yeah, quite a lot to think about. Food for thought, I guess. Um, I think we have people with questions, but uh, the video is going to remain saved in the channel. I'm sure people are going to watch it and they might have questions and they can reach out to you. But
Yeah, definitely.
seriously, thank you for such an interesting and especially that's going around at the moment with IIT Bombay, of course, and also the whole hostel scenario everywhere in India. I guess, it's good that we get sensitized by these talks to know more about the issue. So thank you so much, Dr. Patgiri. I um, I guess we could call it a day for now, and I'd love to have you back again talking on other topics.
Yeah, thank you, Sanchali. Thank you so much. Have a
Thank
good
you
day.
so much. You too. Have a nice weekend ahead. It's a long weekend, and good night.
Yeah, good night.